On a bright morning in 1963, the Pan Am building, later known as the MetLife building, suddenly rose above Grand Central Terminal. This sleek, towering slab of steel and glass didn't just change the skyline, it permanently altered the soul of New York City. For many, it was the corporate arrogance that sliced through the heart of the city's cherished architectural history. Pan Am's ambition, fueled by their desire for an imposing headquarters, forced this brutalist monolith onto an iconic site, a move that incited decades of anger and disdain. This wasn't progress. It was a bulldozing of everything that New Yorkers held dear. How did this colossal decision ignite an architectural war? Chapter 1: The Vision Behind the Tower. Pan Am's rise to the top was unstoppable, and their dream to build the world's tallest office building was a natural reflection of their empire. In the late 1950s, Pan American World Airways was not just an airline. It was America itself, exported to every corner of the globe. Their blue globe logo appeared in 60 nations. Their aircraft connected New York to London, Tokyo to San Francisco, Paris to Buenos Aires. When you thought of international travel, you thought of Pan Am. Their passengers were diplomats, movie stars, businessmen closing deals that would reshape the global economy. And Juan Tripa, the airline's founder and chairman, understood something fundamental about power. Power needs a temple. Tripp sat in his modest offices and watched his competitors build monuments to themselves across Manhattan. The Chrysler Building gleamed in the sun. The Empire State Building pierced the clouds. These structures were more than offices. They were declarations. They told the world who mattered. And Tripp knew his airline deserved the same recognition. The jet age was dawning. Pan Am had just introduced the Boeing 707. Air travel was transforming from luxury to necessity. The world was shrinking, and Pan Am was the thread pulling it together. But where was their monument? Where was the building that announced their dominance to every person walking the streets of New York? Tripp assembled his vision with the precision of an engineer. He didn't want just another office building. He wanted the largest commercial office structure in the world. He wanted something so massive, so undeniable, that it would redefine what corporate architecture could be. The building would house not only Pan Am's global headquarters, but also generate rental income from other tenants. It would be a vertical city, a self-contained universe of commerce and ambition. The numbers were staggering. Tripp envisioned a structure containing 2,400,000 square feet of rentable space. The building would accommodate 25,000 workers. It would cost an estimated $100 million to construct. These figures were not just ambitious. They were unprecedented for a single private development in New York City. But Tripp understood that a building this significant needed the perfect location. It couldn't sit on some random avenue. It needed to anchor itself to something iconic, something that would amplify its importance. And then the opportunity appeared. The air rights above Grand Central Terminal were available. The New York Central Railroad, struggling financially, was willing to lease them. This was it. This was the site that would make history. The vision crystallized in Tripp's mind. A tower rising directly above Grand Central, visible from every approach to Midtown Manhattan. Travelers arriving by train would look up and see Pan Am first. The building would become the gateway to the city. It would be impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. The architects began their sketches. The engineers calculated load capacities and foundation depths. The lawyers drafted agreements with the railroad. Everything was moving forward with the momentum of inevitability. This wasn't a dream anymore. This was happening. What Tripp didn't anticipate was the fury his vision would unleash. Chapter 2: The Site That Was Sacred. Grand Central Terminal, a beacon of New York's architectural identity, suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of corporate ambition. Grand Central Terminal was consecrated ground. Not in the religious sense, but in the civic sense. New Yorkers didn't just pass through Grand Central, they inhabited it. The terminal was where soldiers kissed their sweethearts goodbye before shipping overseas. It was where businessmen checked the arrival boards and caught trains to Connecticut. It was where children pressed their noses against the windows of the oyster bar and marveled at the vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. The building opened in 1913 after 10 years of construction. The project cost $80 million, an astronomical sum for the time. The terminal replaced an older station that had become inadequate for the growing city. Architects Reed and Stem, along with Warren and Wetmore, designed a Beaux Arts masterpiece that combined grandeur with functionality. The main concourse stretched 275 feet long and 120 feet wide. The ceiling soared 125 feet above the marble floor. That ceiling became iconic. Painted in Mediterranean blue, it depicted the constellations of the zodiac. Gold leaf stars marked the positions of over 2,500 celestial bodies. The mural was technically backwards, showing the sky from God's perspective rather than Earth's, but nobody cared. It was magnificent. Sunlight poured through the 3 arched windows at the terminal's east end, illuminating the space with a quality photographers called heaven light. The terminal was more than transportation infrastructure. It was art. It was civic pride made tangible. It represented an era when cities believed public spaces should inspire awe, not just facilitate commerce. Walking through Grand Central, you felt the weight of human achievement. You understood that civilization could create beauty alongside function. And now Pan Am wanted to build on top of it. The proposal didn't destroy Grand Central physically. The terminal would remain operational below. But the plan called for a massive tower to rise directly above the terminal's northern end, straddling Park Avenue. The building would cast shadows across the approach to the terminal. It would block the view of the terminal from Park Avenue. Most devastating, it would destroy the visual relationship between Grand Central and the cityscape around it. Preservationists reacted with immediate horror. The Municipal Art Society, founded in 1893 to protect New York's aesthetic character, mobilized opposition. Their president issued statements calling the proposal an act of vandalism. This wasn't development, this was desecration. Architecture critics joined the outcry. Louis Mumford, writing in The New Yorker, described the plan as a catastrophe in the making. He argued that the building would sever the carefully designed visual corridor along Park Avenue. The terminal had been conceived as a terminus, a destination that commanded respect and attention. Placing a tower above it would reduce Grand Central to a footnote, a basement beneath corporate offices. The New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects debated the project for weeks. Some members saw opportunity in a major new commission. Others saw betrayal of architectural principles. The debate revealed a deeper tension within the profession. Should architects serve their clients' ambitions regardless of urban impact? Or did they have a higher duty to the city itself? Citizens wrote letters to newspapers. They organized petition drives. They attended public hearings and spoke with trembling voices about what Grand Central meant to them. These were not professional preservationists or architecture academics. These were ordinary New Yorkers who understood, perhaps instinctively, that something irreplaceable was at stake. But the forces backing the Pan Am building had resources the preservationists couldn't match. Pan Am had money. The New York Central Railroad needed money. The city government wanted tax revenue. The construction unions wanted jobs. Against this alliance, what power did sentiment hold? The sacred site was about to be sacrificed. Chapter 3. The plan that changed everything. In 1955, when the plan to build the Pan Am building was announced, it was not just a change in landscape, it was the beginning of a cultural war. The architectural renderings appeared in newspapers across the city. New Yorkers saw, for the first time, what Pan Am intended to build. The design called for a slab-shaped tower rising 59 stories above street level. The structure would stand 808 feet tall, making it one of the tallest buildings in New York. But height wasn't the issue. The issue was mass. The building would be enormous in every dimension. The tower measured 200 feet wide and 400 feet long. This wasn't a slender spire that pierced the sky. This was a wall. A massive rectangular wall of concrete and glass that would loom over Grand Central Terminal like a corporate tombstone. The architectural firm Emery Roth and Sons handled the project, working with Walter Gropius and Pietro Belluschi as consulting design architects. Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus School, brought modernist credibility to the project. His involvement was meant to signal that this was serious architecture, not just commercial development. But his participation also drew criticism. How could the prophet of modernism, the architect who preached form following function, endorse this brutal insertion into New York's historic fabric? The design embraced the international style, then dominating corporate architecture. Clean lines, minimal ornamentation, curtain walls of glass and aluminum. The building would be sheathed in precast concrete panels and bronze-tinted glass. There would be no decorative elements, no gestures toward the Beaux-Arts grandeur of Grand Central below. The contrast was deliberate. This was the future asserting itself over the past. The structural engineering was revolutionary. The building would straddle Park Avenue, supported by massive columns sunk deep into bedrock. The foundation would have to carry extraordinary loads while avoiding disruption to the train tunnels below Grand Central. Engineers calculated that the building would weigh approximately 450 million pounds when completed. This weight would be distributed across a foundation system that extended 115 feet below street level. Inside, the building would contain 1.8 million square feet of office space. And this made it the largest commercial office building in the world by square footage. 56 elevators would transport workers between floors. The building would consume enough electricity daily to power a city of 50,000 people. The heating and cooling systems would move air equivalent to filling an Olympic swimming pool every 3 minutes. These numbers were meant to inspire awe. Instead, they inspired dread. The public hearings became battlegrounds. Preservationists presented evidence that the building would fundamentally alter Park Avenue's character. They showed photographs of the terminal taken from various angles, then overlaid them with images of how the new building would appear. The comparisons were devastating. The terminal, once a focal point, would be reduced to a crushed afterthought beneath the tower. Traffic engineers warned about congestion. Adding 25,000 workers to an already crowded area would overwhelm streets and subway lines. The building would generate thousands of additional vehicle trips daily. Park Avenue, designed for elegant residential traffic, would become a commercial corridor choked with taxis and delivery trucks. The city's planning commission held hearings throughout 1955 and 1956. Supporters argued the building would generate millions in tax revenue, and they pointed to construction jobs and economic stimulus. They claimed New York needed to embrace modernity or lose its competitive edge to other cities. Opponents argued that some things couldn't be measured in tax dollars. They spoke about civic identity and architectural heritage. They warned that approving this project would set a precedent. If developers could build on Grand Central, what landmark was safe? The hearings lasted months. Testimony filled thousands of pages, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Pan Am had the money. The railroad needed the lease payments. The city wanted the tax base. In December 1958, the Board of Estimate approved the project. Construction would begin the following year. The war had officially started. Chapter 4: Corporate Arrogance Meets Public Outcry. The public response was swift and furious. This wasn't just a building. This was a slap in the face to New Yorkers who cherished their city's soul. The bulldozers arrived in spring 1959. Workers began excavating the foundation while Grand Central continued operating below. The construction site became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked development. Protesters gathered outside the work site holding signs that read, "Save our skyline," and "Grand Central deserves better." They were ignored. The Municipal Art Society launched a publicity campaign documenting the construction's impact. They published before and after photographs in newspapers. They organized walking tours showing citizens exactly what would be lost. They commissioned studies demonstrating how the building would cast the terminal in shadow for significant portions of the day. Their efforts generated headlines but couldn't stop the work. Architecture critics intensified their attacks. Ada Louise Huxtable, the New York Times architecture critic, wrote scathing columns describing the project as civic vandalism. She argued that the building represented everything wrong with modernist architecture when divorced from urban context. Yes, the individual components were well executed. Yes, Gropius had designed elegant details. But those details meant nothing when the building itself was a brutal intrusion. Louis Mumford went further. He called the Pan Am building a monument to corporate arrogance. In his view, the project embodied the worst impulses of American capitalism. Corporations believed they could buy anything, build anything, destroy anything in pursuit of profit. The building wasn't architecture. It was a declaration of power. It announced that money mattered more than history, more than beauty, more than the collective memory of a city. The legal challenges began immediately. Preservation groups filed lawsuits claiming the Board of Estimate had violated zoning regulations. They argued the building exceeded allowable density for the site. They claimed environmental reviews had been inadequate. They filed injunctions seeking to halt construction. Every lawsuit failed. The courts ruled that the approvals had been properly obtained and that opponents had no legal standing to interfere with private development. Some protesters took more direct action. In 1960, a group of architecture students chained themselves to construction equipment. They were arrested within hours. Artists created protest posters depicting Grand Central crushed beneath a corporate boot. These posters appeared on lampposts throughout Manhattan. They were removed by sanitation workers the next day. The opposition lacked coordination and resources. The Municipal Art Society had a modest budget and a small staff. Individual citizens could write letters and attend meetings, but they couldn't match the institutional power behind the project. Pan Am employed teams of lawyers, public relations specialists, and lobbyists. The New York Central Railroad had political connections stretching back decades. Together, they formed an alliance that crushed opposition through sheer force. The media coverage reflected this power imbalance. Business sections praised the project as exactly what New York needed. They published interviews with Pan Am executives who spoke about economic growth and job creation. They featured architects explaining the building's innovative design. Editorial pages occasionally ran opinion pieces criticizing the project, but news coverage remained largely favorable. What made the situation particularly painful for opponents was watching the building rise. Construction proceeded with ruthless efficiency. The steel frame climbed higher month by month. By 1961, the tower was clearly visible from across Midtown Manhattan. It looked exactly as the renderings had promised: massive, overwhelming, undeniable. Workers in nearby buildings watched the construction from their windows. Some felt excitement at witnessing such an ambitious project. Others felt grief watching their city transform into something they didn't recognize. Secretaries ate lunch in Bryant Park and discussed whether they should start looking for jobs in other cities. If New York could allow this, what else would it allow? The building seemed to feed on the controversy. Every protest made it more visible, and every angry editorial drew more attention to its construction. Pan Am executives understood this instinctively. They welcomed the debate because debate meant publicity. The building was becoming famous before it even opened. But fame and respect are different things. The tower kept rising. The anger kept building. And Grand Central Terminal sat below, beautiful and helpless, waiting for the shadow to fall. Chapter 5. The Collateral Damage of Ambition. As the construction of the Pan Am building escalated, so did the casualties, both architectural and emotional. The financial pressures driving the project remained hidden from public view. Pan Am was not actually as dominant as its publicity suggested. The airline industry in the early 1960s faced increasing competition and rising costs. Jet aircraft required massive capital investments. International routes were becoming crowded as European carriers modernized their fleets. Pan Am needed the building not just as a symbol, but as a revenue generator. The construction budget was $100 million. This represented an enormous bet on New York's office market. The building would only succeed if Pan Am could lease most of its space to outside tenants. Internal projections showed the airline would occupy only 15% of the total square footage. The remaining 85% needed to generate rental income sufficient to cover construction debt and operating costs. This created pressure to maximize rentable space. Every design decision prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. The floor plates were kept as large as possible to minimize circulation space. Column spacing was standardized to create uniform office layouts. The building systems were engineered for economy, not elegance. This wasn't a labor of love. This was a speculative office building disguised as a corporate monument. The human cost of construction became evident as work progressed. Building trades unions provided workers, but safety standards in 1960 were not what they would later become. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration didn't exist yet. Construction sites operated under industry standards that prioritized speed over worker protection. 3 workers died during construction. The first fell from the 42nd floor when a safety harness failed. The second was crushed by a steel beam that swung loose from a crane. The third suffered fatal injuries when a concrete form collapsed. The deaths received brief mentions in newspapers, then disappeared from public consciousness. Construction continued without pause. The environmental impact was never seriously considered. The term environmental impact statement didn't enter common usage until the National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1969. The Pan Am building was designed and built in an era when developers didn't worry about carbon footprints or energy efficiency. The building systems were sized for maximum capacity with no consideration for conservation. The tower would eventually consume enormous quantities of energy. The heating system burned fuel oil at a rate of thousands of gallons per hour during winter. The air conditioning system required multiple large chillers running continuously during summer. The electrical demand was so high that Consolidated Edison had to upgrade the power grid serving that section of Midtown Manhattan. The social cost appeared gradually. As construction progressed, the character of the Grand Central area began changing. The terminal had been the heart of a neighborhood that balanced commerce with elegance. Businesses catered to commuters and travelers. Restaurants maintained a certain standard. Shops sold quality goods to discerning customers. The Pan Am building signaled that this neighborhood was becoming something else. If the tallest office building in the world could be built here, why maintain older, smaller buildings? Property owners began seeing their holdings differently. The modest structures that had housed businesses for generations became underutilized assets. Development pressure increased throughout the area. Within 5 years of the Pan Am building's completion, multiple nearby buildings would be demolished and replaced with modern office towers. The Terminal City neighborhood, once characterized by human-scaled architecture and mixed uses, would transform into a canyon of glass and steel boxes. The Pan Am building wasn't just one building. It was the first domino. Some New Yorkers understood this instinctively. They recognized that approving the Pan Am building established a precedent that would reshape the entire city. If height restrictions could be waived here, they could be waived anywhere. If air rights could be sold and stacked to create massive towers, developers would pursue similar projects across Manhattan. The opposition had argued all this during the approval process. They had warned about precedent and cumulative impact. They had been dismissed as alarmist, but they were right. The Pan Am building's approval fundamentally changed how New York regulated development. The city had demonstrated that iconic landmarks offered no protection against aggressive development. Everything was negotiable. Everything had a price. The construction workers didn't think about these abstractions. They showed up at 6 in the morning, worked 10-hour shifts, and cashed their paychecks. They built what they were told to build. The steel workers were particularly proud. This was the largest office building in the world. That meant something. Their names wouldn't appear in any history books, but they had built a monument. By early 1963, the building was substantially complete. The curtain wall was installed. The mechanical systems were operational. Interior fit-out was underway. The Pan Am was preparing to move its headquarters from the Chrysler Building to its new home above Grand Central Terminal. The damage was done. The collateral was counted. The casualties were filed away in incident reports and forgotten. Now came the moment when New York would have to live with what it had allowed. Chapter 6: The Battle for the Skyline. The skyline was the city's identity, and Pan Am's plan was a direct assault on it. Was New York willing to sacrifice its soul for the sake of modernity? New York's skyline was not accidental. It evolved through a combination of geology, economics, and civic ambition. Manhattan's bedrock could support enormous loads in certain locations, enabling tall structures. Zoning laws shaped how buildings could rise, creating the characteristic setback profiles of Art Deco towers. And individual builders competed to create landmarks that would define the city's image. The Woolworth Building, completed in 1913, stood 792 feet tall. It was called the Cathedral of Commerce, and its Gothic details gave it spiritual grandeur. The Chrysler Building, finished in 1930, reached 1,046 feet. Its Art Deco spire represented the machine age transformed into art. The Empire State Building, opened in 1931, and claimed the title of world's tallest at 1,454 feet. These towers didn't just occupy space, they created meaning. The skyline was how New York presented itself to the world. Photographs of Manhattan's towers appeared in magazines across America and Europe. They symbolized American ambition, capitalism, democracy, modernity itself. The skyline was an argument rendered in steel and stone. It declared that cities could reach toward heaven while remaining grounded in commerce. Park Avenue's relationship to this skyline was carefully orchestrated. The avenue ran north from Grand Central Terminal in a perfectly straight line. Standing at the terminal's southern entrance, you could look up Park Avenue and see the MetLife Tower to the south and various elegant apartment buildings to the north. The views were composed, intentional, beautiful. The Pan Am Building would destroy these sightlines permanently. The tower would sit directly astride Park Avenue, blocking views from both directions. Standing at street level, you would no longer see through to the terminal's facade. You would see concrete and glass looming overhead. The avenue's spatial logic would be severed. Architecture critics recognized this immediately. They understood that cities are experienced sequentially. You don't see everything at once. You move through spaces, and those spaces create narrative. Grand Central Terminal was the climax of that narrative when approaching from either north or south. The building was revealed gradually, then appeared in full glory as you drew near. The Pan Am Building would reduce Grand Central to an underpass. You would pass beneath the tower to reach the terminal. The sequence would reverse. Instead of approaching a destination, you would be walking under an obstacle. The psychological impact would be profound. Though urban planners warned about broader implications, if this project succeeded, developers would pursue similar air rights developments across the city. The concept was simple. If you owned a building that didn't use its full development rights, you could sell those rights to adjacent properties. This would enable the creation of towers far larger than zoning would normally allow. The potential for abuse was obvious. Historic buildings that were protected from demolition could still be buried beneath towers built on their air rights. The legal protections would become meaningless. You could preserve a landmark while destroying everything that made it significant. This wasn't theoretical. Real estate developers were already exploring similar projects. The Pennsylvania Railroad was considering a tower above Penn Station. The owners of St. Bartholomew's Church were negotiating to sell their air rights. The Pan Am Building proved these projects were feasible. If it could be built above Grand Central, it could be built anywhere. The defenders of New York's skyline were fighting a losing battle. They had moral arguments and aesthetic principles. Their opponents had money and political connections. And in early 1960s, New York, money was winning. The construction reached its highest point in November 1962. Workers placed the final steel beam in a topping-out ceremony. Pan Am executives attended and made speeches about progress and modernity. Photographers captured images of the building dominating the skyline. Those images appeared in newspapers the next day. Some New Yorkers saw the photographs and felt pride. Their city was building the largest office building in the world. Others saw the same photographs and felt rage. Their city was destroying its own beauty. The building stood 808 feet tall. It contained 59 floors above ground and 3 below. It weighed 450 million pounds. These numbers were impressive, but numbers couldn't capture what had been lost. The view north from Grand Central Terminal was gone. The view south along Park Avenue was blocked. The visual relationship between the terminal and the surrounding neighborhood was severed. The skyline that had evolved organically over 50 years had been disrupted by a single act of corporate will. The battle for the skyline was over. The casualties were permanent. New York would never look the same again. But the building still had to be occupied. It still had to function. And the question remained whether New Yorkers would ever accept this intruder in their midst. Chapter 7. The Tower of Resentment. As the building neared completion, so did the unrelenting fury of the New York public. It wasn't just about a building anymore. It was a monument to everything they feared. The Pan Am building officially opened on March 7, 1963. There was no grand ribbon-cutting ceremony. Pan Am executives understood that celebrating would be tone-deaf. They issued press releases highlighting the building's technical achievements and moved in quietly. The building immediately became the most visible structure in Midtown Manhattan. You could see it from New Jersey. You could see it from Brooklyn. You could see it from ships entering New York Harbor. The tower announced itself to anyone within miles. This visibility, which Pan Am had sought, became a source of constant resentment. New Yorkers who commuted through Grand Central experienced the building's presence daily. They emerged from subway tunnels or descended from Metro North trains and walked through the terminal's grand concourse. Then they stepped outside and confronted the tower looming overhead. The psychological impact was crushing. The terminal that had once felt like a gateway now felt like a cage. Architecture critics continued their assault. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote that the building was everything wrong with modern architecture. It was competent, but soulless. It was technically proficient, but emotionally dead. It demonstrated that architects could build anything, but hadn't stopped to ask whether they should. The criticism went beyond aesthetics. The building functioned poorly in practice. The massive floor plates created deep interior spaces that felt oppressive. The curtain wall system leaked during heavy rain. The heating and cooling systems struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures. Workers who moved into the building complained about drafts, noise, and poor air quality. The elevator system became notorious. With 56 elevators serving 59 floors and 25,000 workers, wait times during rush hours stretched to 15 minutes. The elevator banks were poorly organized. You could press a button and have no idea which elevator would arrive or how long you would wait. Office workers developed strategies, learning which banks served which floors and timing their arrivals to avoid peak congestion. The building's relationship to Grand Central created operational problems nobody had anticipated. The tower sat directly above the terminal's train tracks. This meant vibrations from passing trains transmitted through the building's structure. Workers on lower floors could feel trains arriving and departing. The vibrations were subtle but constant, creating a low-frequency hum that some found maddening. The exterior became immediately grimy. The bronze-tinted glass and precast concrete panels were supposed to create a sleek, modern appearance. Instead, they collected dirt and pollution. New York's air quality in the 1960s was terrible. In coal-burning power plants and millions of automobiles created smog that coated every surface. The Pan Am building's flat surfaces were particularly vulnerable. Within months, the tower looked dingy. The public spaces fared no better. The building's lobby connected to Grand Central through underground passages. These passages were supposed to create a seamless transition between terminal and tower. In practice, they became confusing, poorly lit tunnels that commuters rushed through while avoiding eye contact with panhandlers. The plaza level around the building's base was windswept and unwelcoming. The tower's massive bulk created downdrafts that made windy days miserable. Women lost their hats. Men struggled to keep their coats closed. In winter, the wind chill made the area brutal. People learned to avoid walking near the building if they could. The resentment took forms both subtle and overt. Graffiti appeared on the building's lower levels within weeks of opening. Someone spray-painted corporate greed across an entrance. The words were cleaned off and appeared again. This became a pattern. The building's owners assigned security guards to watch for vandals, but the graffiti continued. Taxi drivers developed a particular hatred for the building. The taxi stand at Grand Central became impossibly crowded. Thousands of additional workers meant thousands of additional cab rides. The line of waiting taxis stretched for blocks. Drivers sat in traffic for hours, burning fuel, making no money. They blamed the building for destroying their livelihoods. Local businesses had mixed reactions. Restaurants near the building saw increased lunch traffic but struggled to accommodate the crowds. The existing establishments couldn't handle 25,000 new workers. Lines stretched out the door. Service quality declined. Some long-time businesses closed, unable to compete with new fast food operations that opened to serve the office workers. The building changed the neighborhood's character completely. The area around Grand Central had been mixed use, with offices, shops, hotels, and apartment buildings. The Pan Am building's opening accelerated the conversion to pure commercial use. Landlords realized they could make more money renting to corporations than to residents or small businesses. Within a decade, most of the residential buildings would be gone. Some New Yorkers learned to ignore the building through sheer force of will. They trained themselves not to look up. They developed routes through the city that minimized their exposure to its presence. They pretended it didn't exist. This required effort. The building was impossible to truly ignore. But they tried. Others embraced their resentment. They referred to the building as the Pan Am eyesore or the Grand Central Destroyer. They told visitors about the controversy. They explained what had been lost. They kept the anger alive through storytelling, passing the resentment to a new generation. The Tower of Resentment stood complete. It would stand for decades, and the question became whether time would soften the anger or whether the building would remain forever hated. Chapter 8: The Public's Silent Resistance. Though the building stood tall, the heart of New York's opposition did not go quietly. It simmered in whispers, protests, and underground movements. The organized resistance didn't end when the building opened. The Municipal Art Society continued advocating for stronger preservation laws. They had lost the battle over Pan Am, but they were determined to prevent similar disasters. They began documenting threatened landmarks across the city. They published reports showing which buildings were vulnerable to demolition or air rights transfers. This work laid groundwork for the preservation movement that would transform New York. In 1965, just 2 years after the Pan Am building opened, the city established the Landmarks Preservation Commission. This gave New York legal tools to protect historic buildings from demolition or insensitive alteration. The Pan Am building's construction had been the catalyst. The outrage it generated finally convinced politicians that preservation needed enforcement power. The first landmark designated under the new law was the Astor Library. But everyone understood the subtext. The commission existed because of Grand Central. It existed because New York had learned a painful lesson about what happened when development proceeded without constraints. Ironically, the Pan Am building's presence above Grand Central probably saved the terminal. In 1968, Penn Station was demolished to make way for Madison Square Garden. The destruction shocked New Yorkers. Penn Station had been architecturally significant, a Beaux Arts masterpiece comparable to Grand Central. Its loss demonstrated that even major landmarks were vulnerable. Preservationists immediately rallied to protect Grand Central. The terminal was designated a landmark in 1967. When the New York Central Railroad tried to build another tower above the terminal in the 1970s, preservationists fought back. The legal battle reached the Supreme Court. In 1978, the court ruled that landmark designation was constitutional. Grand Central was saved. The Pan Am building became part of that salvation narrative. Because it existed, because it demonstrated the damage that could be done, New Yorkers wouldn't allow a second tower. The resentment toward the Pan Am building helped generate political will to protect what remained. But the silent resistance took other forms beyond official preservation efforts. Architecture schools began using the Pan Am building as a case study in what not to do. Students analyzed the project's failures. They studied the broken sight lines, the poor integration with Grand Central, the hostile pedestrian environment. The building became a cautionary tale taught to every aspiring architect in New York. Critics developed a new vocabulary to describe buildings like Pan Am. They called them insensitive to context. They described them as brutal insertions into the urban fabric. These phrases became code. Everyone understood what they meant. They meant buildings that prioritized private profit over public good. They meant architecture that destroyed more than it created. Photographers documented the building's negative impacts. They captured images of Grand Central dwarfed by the tower. They showed the shadows cast across Park Avenue. They photographed the windswept plazas and dingy concrete. These images appeared in architecture journals and Preservation Society publications. They built a visual case against the building that words alone couldn't achieve. Ordinary citizens resisted in smaller ways. They avoided renting office space in the building if they had alternatives. Companies that could afford to be choosy selected other locations. The building never achieved the prestige Pan Am had hoped for. It was fully leased, but not by the most desirable tenants. It became known as a place where back-office operations went, not where deals got made. The building's unpopularity affected Pan Am itself. The airline had built the tower to symbolize its dominance. Instead, it became associated with corporate arrogance and aesthetic failure. When people thought of Pan Am, they increasingly thought of the building. And when they thought of the building, they thought of everything it had destroyed. This reputational damage was subtle but real. Pan Am's brand image had been cosmopolitan and glamorous. The building made the airline seem heavy-handed and tone-deaf. This mattered in an industry where brand perception influenced passenger choices. People wanted to fly with airlines that felt modern and sophisticated, not with airlines that bulldozed historic landmarks. The resistance also manifested in academic writing. Urban planning scholars studied the Pan Am building as evidence that market forces alone couldn't produce good cities. They argued that development needed regulation, that aesthetics mattered, that cities had interests beyond maximizing tax revenue. These arguments gained traction in the 1970s as faith in unconstrained development diminished. Artists created works responding to the building. Photographers made it the subject of projects exploring urban alienation. Painters depicted it as a symbol of dehumanizing modernism. Poets wrote about the violence of its insertion into the cityscape. The building became a muse for work about loss, change, and the corruption of civic values. The public's silent resistance was effective precisely because it was silent. There were no more dramatic protests, no more lawsuits, no more angry editorials. Instead, there was a collective decision to withhold affection. The building would never be loved. It would never be celebrated. It would be tolerated because it couldn't be removed, but it would never be accepted. This kind of resistance is harder to fight than open opposition. Pan Am couldn't respond to it. The building's owners couldn't change public perception through advertising or public relations. The damage was done. The resentment was permanent. The whispers continued. The stories were passed down. And the building stood, unloved and unlovable, a monument to ambition that had overreached. Chapter 9. The Moment of Reckoning. The MetLife name became synonymous with redemption for the building, but for many, it would never be enough. Pan Am's dominance didn't last. The airline industry changed dramatically in the 1970s and 80s. Deregulation increased competition. Fuel prices spiked during the oil crises. New carriers entered the market with lower costs and more efficient operations. Pan Am, burdened by high labor costs and aging aircraft, struggled to adapt. The airline's financial troubles intensified through the 1980s. Pan Am sold routes, cut staff, and liquidated assets. In 1981, they sold the building. The transaction valued the tower at $400 million. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company purchased it and immediately changed the name. The Pan Am building became the MetLife building. The rebranding happened overnight. Workers arrived one morning to find new signage being installed. The Pan Am logo, which had crowned the building since opening, was removed. The MetLife name replaced it. The physical transformation was superficial. The building itself remained unchanged, but the symbolic shift was profound. For some New Yorkers, the name change felt like justice. Pan Am had destroyed something beautiful, and now they were losing their monument. The airline that had been so arrogant, so convinced of its permanence, was being erased from the skyline. There was satisfaction in watching the logos come down. Others saw the change as proof that corporate monuments are temporary. Today's dominant company is tomorrow's bankruptcy. The buildings outlast their creators. The Pan Am building had been built to last centuries, but the airline didn't last 3 decades. What did that say about corporate ambition? MetLife's ownership brought changes to the building's operation. They invested in renovations and system upgrades. The facade was cleaned. The mechanical systems were modernized. The elevators were improved. The building became more functional, more efficient, but it couldn't become beautiful. The fundamental problems remained. The name change didn't soften New York's resentment. The building was still blocking views of Grand Central. It was still casting shadows across Park Avenue. It was still disrupting the urban fabric. Changing the sign didn't change what had been lost. Architecture critics noted that the building's failure went beyond Pan Am. The design itself was flawed. Walter Gropius, one of the consulting architects, never publicly acknowledged any regret. But Pietro Beluschi, the other consultant, later expressed ambivalence about the project. He said in interviews that the building had been compromised by commercial pressures. The design they wanted to create wasn't the design that got built. This raised uncomfortable questions about architectural responsibility. Could architects blame their clients when projects went wrong? Or did accepting a commission mean accepting responsibility for the result? Gropius and Belushi had lent their names to the project. Their participation had given it credibility. They couldn't distance themselves when the building proved unpopular. The preservation movement that emerged after the Pan Am building's construction fundamentally changed New York. By the 1990s, the city had designated thousands of individual landmarks and dozens of historic districts. The Landmarks Preservation Commission had real power. Developers had to navigate a complex approval process before altering significant buildings. Grand Central Terminal received the full benefit of this protection. In the 1990s, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority undertook a comprehensive restoration. The main concourse ceiling was cleaned, revealing colors that hadn't been visible in decades. The Constellation mural was repaired and its stars re-gilded. The terminal was restored to its 1913 glory. The restoration cost over $200 million. It was funded through a combination of public money and private contributions. New Yorkers who had fought to save the terminal from further development now celebrated its rebirth. The contrast between the restored terminal and the Pan Am building above it became even more stark. Tourists began visiting Grand Central as a destination, not just a transportation hub. They marveled at the architecture. They ate at the renovated oyster bar. They shopped in the retail spaces beneath the vaulted ceiling. The terminal became one of New York's most beloved public spaces again. The MetLife building remained excluded from this affection. It was the thing you noticed but didn't talk about. It was the scar you learned to overlook. Guidebooks mentioned it only to explain what had been controversial about its construction. Architecture tours pointed it out as a cautionary tale. MetLife eventually sold the building too. In 2006, a partnership of investors purchased it for $1.7 billion. The price reflected Manhattan real estate values, not any particular love for the structure. It was valuable because of its location and size, not because of its architecture. The new owners considered another rebranding, but the MetLife name stuck. It had been in place for 25 years. The building had become known as MetLife to a generation of New Yorkers who barely remembered Pan Am. Changing the name again would be confusing and expensive, so it remained the MetLife building, forever separated from the airline that created it. The moment of reckoning had passed. Pan Am was gone. The building had been renamed. Grand Central had been restored. But the original sin remained. The tower still loomed above the terminal. The sight lines were still broken. The urban fabric was still torn. Some wounds don't heal. They just stop bleeding. Chapter 10. The City That Never Forgave. Decades later, New York had accepted the building, but its citizens still bore the scars of that brutal architectural conquest. By the 21st century, the MetLife building had become part of New York's skyline in the way that scar tissue becomes part of skin. It was there. It couldn't be removed. People learned to live with it. But acceptance is not the same as forgiveness. And new generations of New Yorkers grew up never knowing the city without the building. They saw photographs of Grand Central before the tower was built and struggled to imagine how different the area looked. The building had been there their entire lives. It was simply part of the landscape. But the older generation remembered. They remembered the controversy. They remembered the protests. They remembered feeling powerless as the building rose despite their opposition. Yeah, and they made sure younger New Yorkers knew the story. The building became a teaching tool. Parents pointed it out to children and explained what had been lost. Architecture professors showed students the before and after photographs. Preservationists referenced it when arguing for stronger protections of other landmarks. The Pan Am building story was passed down as a cautionary tale about what happens when profit overwhelms civic values. The resentment evolved, but never disappeared. By 2010, few people remembered Juan Trippe or cared about Pan Am's corporate ambitions. But they understood that the building represented something larger. It represented a moment when New York chose money over beauty, when the city valued tax revenue over architectural heritage, when private interests triumphed over public good. This understanding shaped future development battles. When developers proposed new towers near beloved landmarks, opponents invoked the Pan Am building. They used it as evidence that some locations should be off-limits. They argued that not every site should be available for maximum development. Some places were too important, too meaningful, too central to the city's identity. These arguments didn't always succeed. New York remained a city driven by real estate economics. Developers continued proposing controversial projects. City officials continued approving them. But the opposition was better organized and more effective than in the 1960s. The preservation movement that emerged from the Pan Am controversy had matured into a sophisticated force. The building itself aged ungracefully. The curtain wall system that had seemed modern in 1963 looked dated by 2000. The precast concrete panels weathered poorly. The bronze-tinted glass gave the building a murky appearance. Maintenance was expensive and constant. The building required continuous investment just to remain functional. The interior spaces struggled to adapt to changing office needs. The deep floor plates that had maximized rentable area in the 1960s became liabilities in the age of collaborative workspaces and natural light requirements. Modern tenants wanted smaller floors with better views and more windows. The Pan Am building couldn't provide that. The building's environmental performance was terrible by contemporary standards. The single-pane glass provided minimal insulation. The heating and cooling systems were inefficient. The building consumed energy at rates that would be unacceptable for new construction. Retrofitting for better performance was possible, but prohibitively expensive. Some preservationists argued, with dark irony, that the building should be landmarked. It was over 50 years old. It represented a significant moment in New York's architectural history. It was associated with major architects. It met the technical criteria for designation. Landmarking it would prevent demolition and force better maintenance. This argument generated heated debate. Could you landmark a building that had been built over preservationist objections? Should you protect something that everyone agreed was a mistake? The discussion revealed how complicated architectural legacy becomes over time. Buildings that were controversial when new can become historically significant simply by surviving. The debate remained theoretical. Nobody seriously proposed demolishing the building. It was too large, too expensive to tear down, too central to the city's infrastructure. The building would stand regardless of whether anyone loved it. It had achieved permanence through sheer mass, not through beauty or cultural value. Grand Central Terminal, meanwhile, thrived. The restoration of the 1990s had been so successful that additional improvements continued for decades. The terminal added new retail spaces, improved signage, and enhanced accessibility. It became a model for how historic structures could be adapted to contemporary needs while respecting their original character. The contrast was intentional. Every improvement to Grand Central highlighted what the Pan Am building wasn't, and every celebration of the terminal's beauty emphasized the tower's ugliness. The two structures existed in permanent opposition, locked together physically, but forever opposed aesthetically and philosophically. The city never forgave, the scars never fully healed. But New York learned to tell the story differently. The Pan Am building became evidence that preservation mattered. It became proof that cities needed to protect their heritage actively, not assume that beauty could survive on its own. This lesson was expensive. It required destroying something irreplaceable to learn that some things shouldn't be destroyed. But the lesson was learned. And New York became a better, more thoughtful city because of it. The building stands. The resentment persists. And the city remembers. Chapter 11. The Price of Progress. As the city evolved, so did its relationship with modernity. But was the price of progress too high for New Yorkers to ever fully accept? The Pan Am building forced New York to confront fundamental questions about urban development. What did progress mean? Was bigger always better? Did economic growth justify any aesthetic cost? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were practical concerns that affected how the city regulated development. The modernist architects who designed the Pan Am building believed they were advancing architecture. They embraced new materials, new construction techniques, and the new spatial concepts. They rejected historical ornamentation as dishonest. Buildings should express their structure honestly, they argued. Function should determine form. This ideology produced remarkable buildings in some contexts. The Seagram building, completed in 1958, applied these principles successfully. Its bronze and glass facade was elegant. Its plaza provided public space. Its proportions were refined. The building worked because it respected its context while expressing modernist values. The Pan Am building applied the same principles with disastrous results. The difference was context. The Seagram building sat on Park Avenue where it complemented surrounding structures. The Pan Am building sat on Grand Central where it crushed a beloved landmark. Modernist ideology couldn't overcome bad siting. This distinction became crucial. New York learned that architectural quality depended on more than individual building design. Context mattered. Relationships between buildings mattered. The cumulative effect of multiple developments mattered. You couldn't evaluate structures in isolation. The price of learning this lesson was steep. Grand Central's visual relationship to Park Avenue was permanently damaged. The terminal's role as an urban focal point was diminished. The neighborhood's character was fundamentally altered, and these losses couldn't be quantified in dollars. They represented something more valuable than money. But progress had also brought genuine benefits. The Pan Am building housed thousands of jobs. It generated tax revenue that funded city services. It demonstrated that New York could build at unprecedented scale. These achievements were real. They improved lives in measurable ways. The tension between these competing values defined New York's relationship with development for generations. and every major project sparked debate. Should the city prioritize economic growth or preservation? Jobs or beauty? The future or the past? These questions didn't have simple answers. The preservation movement that emerged after the Pan Am building tried to find balance. Landmarks law didn't prohibit development. It required that development respect historically significant structures. Developers could still build, but they had to work within constraints. The market couldn't decide everything, and this approach wasn't perfect. Designation was sometimes arbitrary. The review process could be slow and expensive. Developers complained about uncertainty and delays. Preservationists argued the protections didn't go far enough. Nobody was completely satisfied. But the system worked better than the alternative. Buildings like Grand Central were saved from demolition. Historic districts preserved neighborhood character. New development still occurred, but with greater sensitivity to context. New York maintained its architectural heritage while continuing to evolve. The Pan Am building demonstrated what happened without these protections. It showed the market's logic carried to its conclusion. The site above Grand Central was valuable. Development maximized that value. The result was economically rational and aesthetically catastrophic. This became the building's ultimate legacy. It proved that economics alone couldn't create good cities. Beauty mattered. Context mattered. Cultural memory mattered. These things had value, even if they couldn't be expressed on a balance sheet. The broader culture absorbed this lesson slowly. In the 1960s, faith in progress was nearly universal. Technology would solve all problems. Economic growth would benefit everyone. The future would be better than the past. These assumptions went largely unquestioned. The 1970s brought disillusionment, economic recession, urban decay, and environmental crisis challenged optimistic narratives. People began questioning whether progress always meant improvement. The Pan Am building became a symbol of that skepticism. It represented progress that destroyed more than it created. By the 21st century, attitudes had shifted further. Sustainability became a priority. Historic preservation was widely accepted. Dense urban development was encouraged, but with careful attention to design quality and community impact. The Pan Am building's construction would likely be impossible under contemporary regulations. This represented genuine progress. New York had learned from its mistakes. The city developed better tools for managing development. It balanced competing interests more thoughtfully. It preserved more of its heritage while remaining economically dynamic. But the Pan Am building remained as evidence of the price paid for that education. You could walk through Grand Central, look up, and see the lesson written in concrete and glass. Progress without wisdom destroys. Growth without constraint consumes. Ambition without responsibility leaves scars. The building couldn't be undone. The damage was permanent, but understanding what went wrong prevented similar mistakes. That understanding was valuable. It was purchased at high cost, but the price, perhaps, was worth paying. New York evolved. The relationship with modernity matured. And the Pan Am building stood as a monument to expensive wisdom. Chapter 12. What's Left Behind. The legacy of the Pan Am building is not in its architecture, but in the story it tells about ambition, pride, and the cost of sacrificing beauty for modernity. Stand today at the southern entrance to Grand Central Terminal. Look north toward the main concourse with its restored ceiling and gold leaf stars. Turn around. Look south through the arched windows. The MetLife building dominates the view. 808 feet of concrete and glass looming over the terminal like a corporate tombstone. This is the legacy, this permanent juxtaposition of beauty and its negation. The Pan Am Building taught New York what could be lost. Before its construction, many New Yorkers believed their city's great buildings were somehow protected by their importance. Grand Central was too significant to threaten. Penn Station was too beautiful to demolish. These assumptions proved catastrophic. Penn Station's destruction in 1968 shocked the city awake. But the warning signs appeared earlier with the Pan Am Building. The tower demonstrated that nothing was sacred if enough money was at stake. This realization transformed how New York thought about preservation. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, created in 1965, gave the city tools to fight back. The commission designated thousands of buildings and dozens of historic districts. It saved structures that would otherwise have been demolished. It preserved neighborhoods that would otherwise have been transformed. This institutional legacy directly traces to the outrage generated by the Pan Am Building. The building also changed architectural culture. It became impossible for architects to ignore urban context after the Pan Am controversy. Our architecture schools began teaching contextual design. Professional organizations developed ethical guidelines about an architect's responsibility to the city. These changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened. Individual careers were affected too. Walter Gropius, already a legendary figure when the Pan Am Building was designed, saw his reputation complicated by the project. He remained influential, but critics cited the building as evidence that European modernism worked poorly in American cities. His legacy became more ambiguous. The building's corporate legacy was entirely negative. Pan Am created the tower to symbolize its dominance. Instead, it became associated with arrogance and aesthetic insensitivity. When the airline collapsed in 1991, few mourned. The building, rebranded as MetLife, outlived its creator by decades. This reversal contained its own lesson about corporate monuments. Companies are temporary. Buildings are permanent. Creating a monument to corporate power is inherently absurd because corporations don't last long enough to justify monuments. The Pan Am Building would likely stand for 200 years. Pan Am lasted 64. The human legacy is more complex. Thousands of New Yorkers fought the building's construction and lost. They attended hearings, wrote letters, organized protests, and achieved nothing. This experience of powerlessness shaped a generation's relationship with civic engagement. But their opposition wasn't entirely futile. It created political pressure that eventually produced landmarks legislation. It built institutions that would protect future landmarks. It established that ordinary citizens had the right to influence how their city developed. These achievements came too late to save Grand Central from the tower, but they saved other buildings and neighborhoods. The architectural legacy is straightforward. The building is widely regarded as a failure. Architecture critics cite it as a cautionary tale. Preservation organizations use it as evidence for why regulation is necessary. Students learn from its mistakes. It has achieved significance as a negative example. But the building serves its function. It houses offices. It generates rent. It provides jobs. Thousands of people work there daily. For them, the building is simply workplace infrastructure. The historical controversy is abstract. They care about elevator speed and temperature control, not architectural theory. This disconnect is itself revealing. Buildings exist in multiple registers simultaneously. The Pan Am Building is both a daily workplace for thousands and a hated symbol for preservationists. Both realities are true. Neither cancels the other. The philosophical legacy addresses a question every city faces. How do you balance preservation and development? How do you honor the past while building the future? How do you protect beauty while encouraging economic growth? The Pan Am building suggests that balance requires active intervention. Markets alone don't produce good cities. Development without constraints destroys cultural heritage. Economic logic must be tempered by aesthetic and historical concerns. This doesn't mean prohibiting development. It means requiring that development respect context. It means designating some locations as too important to alter radically. It means accepting that maximum profitability isn't the only legitimate goal. New York learned these lessons slowly and incompletely. The Pan Am building was built. Penn Station was demolished. Countless other buildings were lost. But eventually, the city developed better systems. It learned to say no. It learned that some things are worth more than money. The building stands today as evidence of what happens when those lessons aren't yet learned. It's a monument to a city that allowed corporate ambition to override civic values. It's a testament to the price of that choice. The price was beauty. The price was harmony. The price was the visual relationship between Grand Central Terminal and the city around it. These losses are permanent. They can be mourned, but not reversed. What's left behind is memory, the story of what happened and why. The understanding that preservation requires vigilance. The knowledge that beauty, once destroyed, can't be rebuilt. Stand beneath the MetLife building. Look up at its massive, graceless bulk. Remember what was lost. Remember what was learned. The building will stand for generations. The resentment will persist for generations. And the lesson will be taught for generations. This is the legacy, not the architecture, but the story. Not the building, but what it represents. Ambition unchecked destroys. Pride untempered scars. Progress without wisdom leaves wounds that never heal. New York knows this now. The knowledge came at terrible cost, but the city remembers, and remembering, it protects what remains.